Yeah, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Please welcome Rosecrans Baldwin, author of this book. Do you remember the first time you came here?
I do remember the first time I came. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, wonderful. Thank you. I was here, you were giving a lecture about, I want to say, natural disasters that had wrecked Los Angeles for centuries. And one of the things that I remember best about it, so it was in this room pre-COVID, so a full stacked house, and I was sitting somewhere on this side, and the next day, I want to say, someone added me on Twitter, and I'm barely on Twitter, but I got the notification, and this person had been drawing my head while seated behind me, and he or she was quite a good artist, and they were just, I guess, captivated by my thinning hair and decided to sort of draw that in their journal, and then they're like, didn't realize that, because you had read an article that I had written, and you actually included it as part of the lecture.
You had a great quotation in there that I thought nailed Los Angeles, which was really hard to do, so I quoted it. And you came back, didn't you?
Yes.
And I quoted it again.
Yes.
And this is one of my favorite moments in this auditorium. Someone said, Greg, who's the author of that quote? And I said, well, he's right there. And so you two had a little talk. That's nice. Do you remember Wendy?
I believe so. I believe I quote her in the book.
You do.
So there's a chapter in the book that talks about, among other things, the theme of the chapter is a lot about the homeless problem, or the unhoused problem, or however you want to call it, also our problem with mental illness and drug addiction here in Los Angeles. In any case, during a meeting here in this room, a woman whom I did not know, who's, I guess, named Wendy, someone raised their hand towards the end, and there was this lively discussion going on, and someone, I think in a sentence, just described someone as a homeless person, or a vagrant perhaps, and she, from the back, shouted out, "You mean a wilderness person?" And I was so moved by that, because no one had really ever nailed that. I don't know exactly what she meant by it, but what it meant for me is something that I had noticed quite a lot. At the time I was reporting a lot, or researching a lot for this book, is that so much of what some people, quite a few people, struggle with in greater LA day to day are often things that have to do with living in the wilderness. It is about finding shelter and finding food and water and preserving safety and protecting yourself. And when she summarized, put it just like that in that one succinct little sentence, I was like, really, a flip of a switch.
Wendy did that a lot for us. She's not here. I think the last we talked to her, she was heading to San Francisco to get to Hawaii. So I'm not sure how that works, but Wendy had 2 grocery carts, and she went everywhere, and they were full. And Wendy would come in here, and we get, it's Los Angeles, you get people coming and going. She would come in here, she would always leave an offering for us. One time it was bagels, and we're like, no. But, that's not the point. The point is she left an offering every time, books, something like that. And she would sit back in that corner, and I'm convinced it's because she knew there was an odor about her, because she didn't have access to showers. And I remember the first time she was here, it was 2016, and I was lecturing on some aspect of the Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, and she said, well, I think you mean this. And I'm like, what? And she corrected me on my lecture on the Vedas. So she was well-read, well-traveled, and came here a lot. We miss her. You are a good writer. Why would you take this on? This is Los Angeles. This is the uninterpretable city, I call it sometimes. So it's a monumental task, first of all. And secondly, you're following in the footsteps, so to speak, of Rayner Banham, Linnell George, Carrie McWilliams, a whole host of others, and I'm not even including the creative writers, just like not including Joan Didion. would you want to do such a thing?
I mean, like, why did I bite off way more than I could chew?
Well, it's clearly not more than you can chew, but at first I bet it felt that way.
So I definitely did not know what I was getting into. That's the first thing. And once it started to dawn on me what I had gotten myself into, I was struck with fear. And there was daily anxiety, and there was, so here's, I guess, how the book came about was, my wife and I, my partner, Rachel and I moved to Los Angeles a couple years ago, and instantly, and I didn't have any history in LA. I do have a cousin, my mom's cousin lives here, but I'd only been here probably twice or 3 times before that. And I sort of felt 2 things right off the bat. One of them was I found Los Angeles confusing, confounding, intimidating, and also like really exciting and thrilling. So and I think that's a very common reaction, I think, for a lot of newcomers. Second, though, I also felt deeply at home here. And I don't have quite a great way of explaining why that came about, but it was really within a week or 2. And I sort of moved around a lot as a kid and have lived in a bunch of places as an adult, but LA just felt right to me for a lot of reasons. And so I started keeping a diary, just recording thoughts and impressions and weird experiences. This is in the book, but this was early in the morning, sunrise, West Hollywood, a parking lot. I get out of my car, and there's a big guy coming at me really fast. And he's big. He's this big white dude, probably like 220, 230, linebacker kind of profile, and he's on a tiny bike. He's on a BMX bike that someone here could buy for their 6-year-old safely. Be like, oh, that's an appropriate sized bicycle. So he's flying at me on his bike, and he comes to a halt, and he screeches to a halt, like really like BMX bike, Michael J. Fox, he's got his vest on, but he's looking rough. I mean, he's living hard on the streets, and he says menacingly to me, if I made a movie called Revenge City, would you go watch it? And I'm like, right? Like the sun is rising behind him, and it's again 6 in the morning. And so I said, what? Because I honestly, one, I thought I was about to get jacked, and I want to now please this person to prevent that from happening in my fantasy. But 2, I honestly did not understand what he said. And so he said, if I made a movie, Revenge City, would you go see it? There's just this silence, and I'm like, okay, I'll be honest. I was like, well, yeah, it's a good title, yeah, probably. He's like, that's what I thought. And he pedals away, and so, I have to write that down. So the point is, there was an accretion of events, both odd and moving, and then the book was never an exercise to try to explain Los Angeles, to wrap up Los Angeles. Person after person, when I started doing the reporting, interviewing, talking to people, they're like, look, don't be stupid. Los Angeles resists single stories. If you go out and you want to grab it with your hand and walk over to someone who's from Los Angeles and be like, here's what your city is, they're going to turn to you and be like, I've been hearing that all my life, thank you so much, East Coaster, go away.
Right, that person's from New York.
Yeah, and I lived in New York for a little bit. So.
Yeah. And stayed in Beverly Hills for the weekend.
Oh yeah.
Read the book.
You're not going to get me to throw anyone under the bus on YouTube. If this was not being recorded, I'd be happy to drag names.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely felt, but I did feel that idea, Harold Bloom, I think, was the one who coined the phrase, the anxiety of influence. Yeah. But the sense of all these people have come before, have done their takes, their versions that are quite good. There are plenty of bad books written about Los Angeles, but Los Angeles doesn't lack for literature. So it became as important to me, if I was going to write this book and try to do an accounting of what Los Angeles meant to me, what are some true things I could say about it, if I was going to go out and do all the reporting, all the interviewing of dozens, ultimately over 100 people, I would need to do as much reading too, if only to sort of get a sense of what other people had said.
But you did that. I mean, you're quoting all the way through the book.
Yeah.
So you did your homework too.
I did, it's not the worst homework. I mean, there's so many good, fun books about LA. I mean, there's, you mentioned Linnell George, and I saw you have her new Octavia book here. There's also, if anyone, okay, so let me just set this up really fast. So this is a nonfiction book. It came out in June. It's about Los Angeles. It's about this idea that I sort of was playing with, that Los Angeles sometimes can feel or be more than just another big city in the United States. And I looked on to the metaphor of a city-state. The idea being that it's not quite a nation, but it's something more than a city, both bigger in size and scale and populations, but also in identity. That it's just, Los Angeles sometimes to me feels more like its own thing than it does a Miami or a Houston or a New York in terms of how it relates to the United States. So went out and started doing that, and what I was going to say really quickly with that, the other new book that just came out, if you have read this book and you like it, there's an amateur historian in LA named Sam Sweet who has a wonderful project called All Night Menu. And his new one just came out. He self-publishes them. You can Google All Night Menu Sam Sweet, but where he does specific addresses around LA and then does this bizarre, really small research on what makes each of them special.
Oh, nice.
So that's just a fun one. Just gonna shout out.
Yeah, and shout out to Linnell, who we tried to have here a couple times. And we're going to get her. She's wonderful. After Image, also, besides the Octavia Butler book. Yep. I think one thing I admire about the book is kind of what we were just talking about, is you come here, and anywhere you go, there's this sense of wanting to close your interpretation of a city. You visit Paris, you want to know what Paris is about. So, okay, it's about this, I get this. And that's too easy. It's always too easy. And I think Los Angeles makes it harder than most cities, simply in terms of scale and diversity, if nothing else. But also, it's just never ends. Like you were saying, your advisors said, don't be stupid, and try to create some closure around this unreal city, to Salyer. And so here's what another thing I like about the book is it's fragments, because fragments is too strong. It's just little points, little paragraphs, and there's some longer sections as appropriate about homelessness and migration and Skid Row and all of that, and Hollywood. But I like that. There's no grand narrative here. It's like what would happen if you drove across the 10. You would see so many different things, and you just capture them here in these nice little paragraphs. I like that very much.
Thank you.
Can you, since we do philosophy and literature, religion and spirituality, can you talk about that part of the book?
Sure, yeah, because, have we talked about this? Do you know about where the idea came from? Because it's very philosophically based.
No.
Awesome.
That's the first thing I read of yours.
All right, okay, here we go. So since I'm in the company of philosophy nerds, now I can actually have, this is like the first audience that I've been able to talk about this in terms of detail. Here we go. Hello, YouTube. You guys can skip ahead. This is going to get wonky. Okay, so I was not a philosophy. I occasionally am a student of philosophy, or I read philosophy, but I'm not trained at all. But I had a roommate in college who was a philosophy major. He had a great record collection. He also loved coffee and certain other things that we shared. In any case, he had this book on his desk, and it was by this British philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. And you're going to start correcting me on pronunciations and what I get wrong, please, because I will. And so Wittgenstein wrote this little book called the Tractatus, which I think is how it's pronounced. And if I understand this correct, he composed a bunch of it while he's serving in World War I, and he's in a bunker, and he's coming up with ideas about how to language and the perceived world sort of communicate with one another. How do they exist side by side? How do we use language to make sense of the world around us? And the book is really interesting. Again, I found it really hard to read. I couldn't get very far through it. But the structure is so cool because it's essentially 7 short chapters. I think it's 7. And each chapter, really, this book is like a pamphlet. It's tiny. And the way it works is, let's say it's the first chapter, and it'll start off with a sentence or 2 sentences or a paragraph, and it's numbered 1.0. I think it's Roman numerals. And it may be, the idea is to he was trying to put down a very simple statement that could be recognized as true in describing the relationship between language and the world. But let's say that simple statement, I'm just going to make something up, is that the sky is blue. Now, he then moves on to the next paragraph, which is now, he numbers it 1.1. And he's basically doing this structure wherein if 1.0 is correct, or if it's true, if the sky is blue, what does that enable me to say next? Or how can I unpack that to make it a little bit more complicated? If the sky is blue, then all things above me are blue. Well, then that's not true, because there's all these things that are above him that are not blue, and so then he goes into that. The idea here is that 7 chapters, as I understand it, each of them broken out into, I don't know, a dozen, 20 of these things where he's just trying to say something true about the world in front of him. And then each chapter is a slightly different, coming at the world from a slightly different angle. So I always thought that structure was just really interesting. And I wanted to use it in a novel, and I tried, and it failed. I was like, okay, well, you know, whatever, some other day. And then I was trying to figure out how this book would work. And so the book has 7 chapters. Each chapter deals with a different aspect of life in Los Angeles. Some are just unavoidable. Yes, Hollywood is part of Los Angeles, even though, frankly, almost no one in Los Angeles has anything to do with Hollywood than, you know, the person going to the movies in Spokane. Another chapter is all about natural disasters, because we do have earthquakes, and we do have flooding, and we do have, but then there's chapters that are things that are not as well known about Los Angeles. And the idea was, if I could go out and find people to talk to, books to read, personally got involved in some very strange adventures, and slowly weave these things together in each chapter around these themes, hopefully the chapters with a lot of design to it, because I mean, I printed out, like I had the book written, I printed out all the pages, put them down on our living room floor, I'm like moving things around. I was like, does this story belong in a chapter about homelessness, or does it belong in a chapter about survival skills? Maybe those are the same chapter, I don't know. Because I went on this survival class in the Angelenos mountains, and it was 3 days and no food, and like no water, it was snowing, it was horrible. Anyway, the point was, hopefully each chapter, with all these things side by side, would have something to say about that theme in a way that would resonate for the reader in the way that it did for me.
Wonderful. I did not know that story.
Okay.
That's Wittgenstein gets his due, finally. He's long forgotten. He was brilliant, yeah. And I love that. As a philosophy reader and teacher, I love that. You get Nietzsche, who does this. You get a French philosopher named Gilles Debord, who just says, I'm just going to do these numbers. Here's what I think. And I love it because not only does it reflect Los Angeles, I think it reflects the contemporary mind, which is fragmented. And you get these pieces of things and you have to put them together. So, and that's another, what you just mentioned is another part of the genius of this book. So you can do Rainer Banham, and I suggest you do. He's weird and wonderful. But it's up here. It's theoretical. I mean, he calls the San Gabriel Valley the plains of id. So, okay. And all that part. So you can do that, or you can do just particular stories. What Rosecrans does is he does both. So he does Los Angeles on the ground, just like he said. He went and talked to people. So in the section on Skid Row, it's not, just Skid Row was begun like this, and throwing statistics. There's a woman he meets there and gets to know very well. And you did that with a group here. And it's okay if you don't want to get into it, but you went all in with this group.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. Yes, and so the fact-checking process for this book was pretty extensive, and it involved several lawyers. So you'll now hear me begin to speak in a way that will reflect time spent around lawyers that helped me avoid litigation. So now I will begin to talk like this. So there was a very popular, let's call them a self-help group in the United States. I think they started out in the mid to late 1970s, called LifeSpring. LifeSpring was quite popular in the late 70s, 80s, and then into the 90s. In the mid-90s, LifeSpring essentially went out of business. I'll explain why in a second. What LifeSpring, it has been said about them, by other people would have purported to sell you or offer as part of their services is that for a workshop of some kind that you would do with them, for which you pay quite a bit of money, you would be transformed. And these would be very long workshops, you and several other people. There was extraordinary reporting done by the Washington Post of this one reporter who I found is still an editor there, and he was able to talk to me a lot about his reporting because he uncovered what was a lot of the stuff that led to their downfall. But in any case, you would, for several days of these very long days and nights, you would learn everything that was wrong about you and then have some perhaps suggestions or new ways of trying to make them right for you. It might be, someone might compare it to a psychological boot camp, similar to basic training in the army, which is to say, let's take who you are and destroy that, and let's start out with something new. Some people, I believe, thought this to be a quite positive thing, perhaps tens or even hundreds of thousands of people. There are also people who had negative experiences, and those negative experiences, you can imagine, ranged the full gamut, as negative as they could be, perhaps. And so, as those things were uncovered, the group faced many lawsuits, and you can either read the book or you can go Google this later. I am just having to, again, I'm sorry for sounding weird. I just have to be careful. In any case, the group was known as I believe, it's known in the field of psychology as a large awareness training or something like that. Other people have used the C word to describe them. The C word is 4 letters long, it ends with T, and it's not improper to say. I realize now I'm getting into weird territory. But you get the idea. So the point is, a hairdresser, a woman who used to own a hairdresser in Beverly Hills, was able to license the teachings and restart it in a basement of a hotel near LAX in the early 2000s. And it is now running strong, I believe. I believe it is quite popular. So I paid approximately $700 to go join this group for a week and spend very long, weepy, tearful nights being screamed at in the dark with 150 other people who definitely demonstrated the full range of populations in Los Angeles. I mean, literally everyone in Los Angeles was there in some form, and they're screaming and they're pounding, and we're doing all these idiotic exercises. I mean, I can't stress to you how idiotic they are. And meanwhile, they were still using, so LifeSpring was known for using the pop songs of the day to help encourage their people participating in these trainings to be moved emotionally. And they hadn't updated the songbook for MITT. So the new organization is no longer called LifeSpring, it's called Mastery and Transformational Training, or MITT. They've also spawned another number of other groups that will not say that they're associated with MITT, but actually are, but they just don't reveal that because there's been some negative associations with MITT that also now involve the C word. In any case, you can go on Yelp and find this too. So anyway, MITT hasn't updated the songbook, so you're just sitting there being yelled at about what an awful person you are, but Cat Stevens is like blasting in your ears, and you're like, dude, like switch to Coldplay or something, like at least seem somewhat updated, I don't know.
Peace Train's a good song.
Yeah, so it's that was an interesting group that I got involved with for about a week, but it truly was very strange, and I came out of it actually, like, it had a very intense reaction to it. And I think that's when you go through many hours of intense duress and hardcore questioning. I mean, I really did at one point, we were asked to imagine our parents dead in front of us in the dark, and meanwhile, you and this other person are sitting clutching knees, only 3 feet away from each other. And I mean, I really hallucinated my mother right there. My mother is not dead. My mother is very well and alive, but I did not have that experience in that moment. And so what was, I can go on and tell anecdotes that seem a little bit wild, but the more meaningful side of this, I would think, is that, and this is what I learned going there and talking to people who were there, but also in a lot of other experiences for this book, is that Los Angeles really has for a long time, and still does, draw people here for a sense of opportunity or a sense of transformation. And those can be everything from people coming here during the Great Migration, and leaving behind the Deep South only to find extraordinary racism and racial covenants here in Los Angeles, but again, a sense of opportunity. It could be people coming from overseas. You know, often people describe Los Angeles as a place that people were just heading west, and it's like, well, no, people going to Los Angeles were headed north, or they were going east. I mean, yes, people were coming west, but that's not really the story of LA. In any case, that idea, that desire to be transformed and to have this deep change can then lead people towards an organization like this. But there was the sense, again, sorry, but there was the sense that they were being taken advantage of. And there was the sense that it wasn't necessarily to their betterment, but to the betterment of the finances of the group that was the true purpose there. And so that was really distressing to witness and also sort of be involved in.
Yeah, well done. I think your lawyers would be pleased. But we'll see.
Yeah.
We were
We
talking.
should talk about Scientology next. Like, let's just really go up.
Oh God, not here.
Okay.
Because, people still think we're Scientology. But I guess philosophical research sounds. Let's
not
cut
cut
that.
Yeah.
There's not going to be anything left of the we were talking earlier. We have connections in the South.
Yes.
I'm from Tennessee. Lived in Nashville. Rachel's from North Carolina. When I was there, I got to hear Dennis Covington speak. I don't know if you know that name. He wrote a book called Salvation on Sound Mountain. And his wife, Vicki Covington, was a novelist. So anyway, that doesn't matter. He wrote a book called Salvation on Sand Mountain, Alabama, where he reported on snake handlers and did it himself. And I'm like, dude, what are you thinking? And he's like, well, I wanted to be more objective. And I'm like, what? That's subjective. But he had a good argument for it, for the objectivity part, not the picking up snakes part. I'm not sure there's a good argument for that. But this kind of immersive reporting, I just admire it so much, and it scares the hell out of me. Case in point, they got in your mind.
Yes, we did.
Group.
Yeah.
And the other people you meet and experiences you have, they affect you pretty clearly on the page.
Yeah.
I mean, why put yourself through that?
Well, I think I'm deeply curious, and I really enjoy people. I was just thinking about this afternoon. I don't know if this happens to anybody else, but I find when I'm around little kids, they often will say to me things like, do you want to see my toys? Or do you want to see my room? Or do you want to see whatever? And you're like, okay, sure, like let's go do that. There was a story in the news this week about a young kid in New Zealand who actually picked up the phone and dialed the police, and they're like, what's your emergency? And he's like, is this police? They're like, what's your emergency? He said, do you want to see my toys? So they sent over a police officer, and the cops got a great social media moment. Congratulations for that. In any case, it was, children act like that, but it is not, adults are very quick, everyone loves talking about themselves. And it doesn't take much to get someone going. People like to tell their stories. It tells an idea of who we are and how we got here and where our people are from and what matters to us. And it often only just takes asking a couple questions for just that to open up. And I enjoy that. And I enjoy hearing those stories. And that was what the objective of the book was to try and sort of, I wasn't that interested in my personal interpretation of Los Angeles. I haven't been here very long. I now know quite a bit about it, but I don't know that much about it. But there are people here from all these different communities that have had homes here and generations of family here and have had wild experiences here. And it was really exciting. And I just felt very enriched going on and talking to people. So that's here's an example. I got to know this young trans woman who she and they and their family were facing eviction just south of Exposition Park. And so in order to raise money to sort of help pay for the legal battle or just general expenses, they started doing poetry nights on their front porch. So they called it Porch Poetry. And the first night, I think they told me that like just 3 or 4 friends showed up. And the idea was that people could pay $5 and participate in an open mic, and if you couldn't pay, you could just hang out. And I went on the third night, and there was like 100 people with a line down the block. And people are selling homemade merch, and there's like food being sold, all this stuff. And so they were talking, people who got up and read poetry that night were talking about what it's like to, so I came to LA and got gifted a sense of home, right? But what happens, and Paul Beatty has written a lot about this, there's a great book called White Boy Shuffle, and Linnell George has written about this a lot, the sense that LA can change instantly, right? It's not like New York where the CVS becomes the Radio Shack becomes the CVS. Like literally, buildings gone, neighborhoods flattened, new highways in the span of 7 years. And what happens if that neighborhood that meant so much to you, or perhaps you didn't even know, maybe perhaps you took it for granted, is suddenly something else? What happens when almost overnight the property developers give it a new name and there's people that look completely different or act completely different, or you just, that sense of home being something that can be taken away from you without recognizing that it's being taken away was quite profound to hear about. So that's happening in, say, Inglewood or Leimert Park or other places. Or, like you said, in Skid Row, I got to know Suzette Shaw. So here's a woman who went from being an executive in Silicon Valley to being homeless in Skid Row. And she's talking to me. She's now, she's been there for 7 years. She's quite successful in her own way. She's a poet, she's an activist, she's on all these boards, she has an apartment, she's all set, she's doing well. But she was talking to me about why is it that so many Angelenos who have no experience of Skid Row will describe someone as being on Skid Row rather than living in Skid Row? Because Skid Row is a proper neighborhood in Los Angeles, the same way that many other neighborhoods are proper neighborhoods of the city of Los Angeles. There are people who live there and raise families there, and also the populations within Skid Row are not at all the same. There are people who are transient, there are people who are homesteaders, there are people who are dangerous, there are people who are not dangerous. It is obviously a very dangerous place, and it can be quite despairing when you walk around it. But I always tell people, you also will see people helping people. You will see people, and not just aid workers, and not just churches or services, but people who are there helping one another. So again, going around different communities, I mean, I spent a long time. There's a lot of reporting I did that's not in the book. I spent a long time getting to a luxury concierge. So he represents billionaires who want to come into town and rent. Oh man, the story. Oh, this is on YouTube. Okay. So it's anonymous.
We don't have to. We can erase it. Just go.
But this story is just so wild. So he was working for, let's just say, a very rich family from another country than the United States, and so they were coming to LA. And they wanted to just rent a nice house for the summer. So he was able to arrange a really nice, very expensive house, I believe in Beverly Hills, as a rental. And they were going to bring in their own furniture from home so to make it more comfortable. So he had to arrange that too. And also they were going to bring over their car collection because they wanted to be able to drive their cars while in Beverly Hills. So he's going to arrange that too. So the cars are on the way, the house has been rented, the furniture's on the way, like right literally in shipping containers coming to LA. And also, the house, as is, isn't quite perfect. So they're going to redo some of the gardening. They're going to redo some of the interiors also. And the owners are like, okay, if you're going to pay for that, like, yeah, you can upgrade our house. They move in. Furniture, cars, everything looks like home. They're settled. 3 days later, they're like, you know what? I think this is a better summer for the Hamptons. So they just take it all and go to the Hamptons instead. So that is another side of Los Angeles. That whole process, he said, cost them probably $3 million just to do a couple days in LA. So again, the people warned me from the beginning. LA is so big, so diverse, so endlessly unfurling. There's no way you're going to be able to grab it. I'm like, that's cool. Literally, yes, it's a book, but like I understand that like whatever I get will be sort of a grasp. I'll have it for a moment, and then I'll let it go. But what I was able to get by talking to all these people from all these things are all these new shades and sides to LA that I had never seen. And so you ask me why put myself into weird situations, or why go out and do all the interviews. Frankly, it's like really rewarding. Like it's just, it's nourishing. And you get to meet all these interesting people and text them with questions in the middle of the night. Because you're like, I know I asked you this, but can I ask you it again? I want you to say it differently.
Wonderful. What a great answer. love what you said at the beginning about how, what did you say, you were here a week and you realized it was home?
Yeah, something like that.
Is that too strong? Is that how
No, I mean, it's how it feels.
So it feels home?
It does, yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
It shouldn't.
No.
There's no reason it should,
Right.
and yet it does.
Right.
What do you think that's about?
Okay, well, I'll spin it back to you for a second, because this is how someone explained it to me, and I thought it rang true. Where you come from, or your people come from, did you feel that was home?
No.
Did you sometimes feel like an outsider
Yes.
there? I think, so this is, when someone asked me that, so I grew up for the most part in the suburbs of Connecticut. In a wealthy town, my family wasn't wealthy. We were doing very well in terms of being, my dad got a management job in New York City. But in any case, there was a sense, not only did I not feel psychologically right, I wasn't economically on the same level as, everyone can go to a high school and there's a rich kid with a fancy car, whatever. But the point is, I just didn't fit in this town for a lot of reasons. And I think I just sort of, even if I wasn't quite an outsider, I wasn't, I would love to say right now I was like an awesome hardcore punk rock kid or whatever. I wasn't. I was just doing my thing. But I think LA has so much, still has so much room for people. Yes, the rents and the prices are crazy.
Yeah.
And it's a very hard place to live. And frankly, Los Angeles is a far more poor city than it is a rich city.
Yes.
At the same time, there is a sense here because Greater Los Angeles, 20 million people. Los Angeles County, 12 million people. I interviewed a rocket scientist, he's a physicist, and he explained to me the way he thought of Los Angeles, and this is in the book, so forgive me for people who've read the book, but that LA to him, the way that you can be on one of the big roads and be driving, and you're going through different neighborhoods, and you know that different kinds of people live in these different kinds of neighborhoods, but at some point, you're just like, when does it stop? And he's like, it's just the Instagram of cities. Like, you just can keep thumbing your way through Los Angeles. I mean, yeah, eventually you hit like Palm Springs, or you hit the ocean, or you're in Ventura, which actually I still consider to be part of LA, maybe Santa Barbara or San Diego. But the point is, like, it's just so big. And so I think there's a sense, even because maybe it's just because the climate is so sunny and the buildings are so low, and there's a sense of expansiveness and open-heartedness among people. And conversations can just feel more open-ended here than in Chicago that I've experienced, or in New York that I've experienced. So there's still, I believe, because this has been a bit of a hallmark to Los Angeles, there's also certainly a lot of closed-mindedness and barriers, and that's why I get into the city-state idea, because we do have many aspects of the city that seem like a updated medieval fortress, So there's both there's openness and there's hardness here. Okay?
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that you'll love about the book if you haven't read it is, for some of the writers on Los Angeles, they're going to say Los Angeles is X, Y, or Z, and then tell you why that's wrong, and then they're going to say Los Angeles is really A, and B and C. Rosecrans doesn't do that at all, but he tries, or he tries to get his head and hands around the city, and he bears that process to the reader, which I'd never quite seen before. And so I'm thinking in particular of Mike Davis. Yeah. He calls up Mike Davis. He's like, I'm thinking of LA as a city-state. And grumpy Mike Davis says, nah. but it sparked something in you, right? Or yeah. he said it was a metaphor.
Well, so he said it was, and so for anyone who doesn't know, Mike Davis is a wonderful, perhaps the preeminent LA chronicler in books such as City of Quartz and Ecology of Fear. He's written many more books besides that. In any case, and I owe him an enormous piece of debt. He blurbed the book, and he was willing to be interviewed several times for it.
Which is not common for him.
Is that true?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think he talks to them.
Yeah, well, he was sweet as could be with me, and he, the very first conversation, I was like, yes, I've been kicking around this idea of Los Angeles as a city-state. What do you think? And he's like, well, it doesn't work. He's like, Los Angeles's financial, basically, he made the point, which is true, I believe, is that Los Angeles's finances are owned elsewhere. A lot of the biggest investment in the city is not housed in the city. Los Angeles does not have its own banknotes. We granted, the LA County Sheriff's Department basically answers to nobody and is the largest sheriff's department in the world and has the largest prison system in the entire world. And so we do have that side. But his point was, he said this, he turned around really quickly. He's like, but you could use it as a metaphor. And that's where I guess, so the point is, I'm pretty upfront in the book saying that, like, to understand Los Angeles as a city-state helps me understand Los Angeles a little bit better. It's not a city-state. Los Angeles is a city in the United States. We can't get around that. It's just, that's how our system works. But when you begin to understand all the things that make Los Angeles a little bit different, for example, Los Angeles' economy, just for Los Angeles County, is bigger than 40 states in the United States. We have 20 million people in greater Los Angeles. That's the 5 counties. We have a larger economy than Saudi Arabia or Norway. We have Los Angeles County is the largest government entity after any of the 50 states. In other words, we're not a state, but Los Angeles County is the next biggest governmental federal thing we have in the country. We have upwards of 100 languages taught or spoken in the public schools. We have, I mean, you can just do this, and I did this, like it's a book, but anyway, the point is, like, it's both on a factual level, but then, as Mike was saying, on a metaphorical level, yes, you could make the argument that Los Angeles is a different beast. And so that's where I sort of went running with it.
I've never seen that. I've never seen anyone say, well, I thought maybe about this, and I talked to them, and this and now, and you just worked through it beautifully.
Well, I still think it's a city-state. I'm just,
Sure.
At some point, there's a geographer who's going to come and be like, it's not a city-state. Yeah, I know.
Well, during elections, I like to point out to my family that in the greater Los Angeles area, the population itself is greater than 43 other states.
Yeah.
So figure that into your election calculations. Before we let the audience ask you some questions, where's the best taco?
That is it. You can't do that. Okay, my favorite taco right now is Sonora Town. It's downtown. They, oddly enough, for an LA taco, it's a flour tortilla. They make it themselves. They bring the flour in from Mexico like every week or two. Fabulous tacos at Sonora Town downtown. But it's, any taco truck within 5 feet of me is my favorite taco. I have definitely, when Jonathan Gold, rest in peace, I used to listen to Jonathan Gold way before I ever moved to Los Angeles. We were living in France, and I was able to stream KCRW. And that didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know KCRW. I just had somehow chanced upon this weird little food show where this chef, Evan Kleiman, would talk to this guy who's a food critic once a week, and they would just talk about restaurants. And I didn't care particularly about Los Angeles at that point. I wasn't thinking about moving here. But the way that he talked about the city as being something to explore, as something that you could dig into. I mean, I'm not even a foodie. Like, it was so cool to hear him describe a sense of exploration. He's going around in this, big old pickup truck and just discovering whether it's these Chinese restaurants over here in the valley, or it's these Mexican places in East LA, or it's whatever. So when he died, the day after, I went around. There was that big memorial service downtown, or it was not a service, but like a gathering. But I went around and had 3 of his favorite tacos, and it was just the best. I went down these smoked marlin tacos down in Inglewood, and then over here the mollusca, the shrimp. Shoot, there's one truck that I'm thinking of. In any case, and then I came back to a Oaxacan restaurant in Koreatown, and I went there, and I just finished eating, and I'm very stuffed, and I'm outside, and there's a French family at the ballet. And thankfully, for having lived in France, I sort of learned French while I was there. And I was able to sort of engage with them a little bit. And then they broke into English. And I was asking them, why did they come to LA? And what did they thought of their trip? And they were like, it's just very, very American. And I was like, well, what do you mean? They're like, all of America in Los Angeles, here. I was like, all right, I'll take that. It's true. Everything in Los Angeles is not a microcosm of the United States. I don't try to hold it up in that way. But it is often for the good things and the bad things, often we do a lot of America to the nth degree here.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Well, I was going to say that too. I was thinking that too, is that this book is like Jonathan Gold or even Bourdain in terms of food. Instead of looking for food and tacos, you're looking for people. find stories, and that's a great way to move to.
That's one of the nicest things people have said about this book. Thank you very much.
Well, it's sincere. You're very welcome. I'm a big fan. Would you like to ask Rosecrans anything? Feel free, just raise your hand. Yeah, right here.
Talking of people, I'm curious how you sort of find many of them and how you decide, who you're speaking to, and then similarly for the experiences, where does one start to put together such a list?
Yeah. And I'll repeat the question just in case it didn't get picked up with the video. But the question was, where to begin in terms of finding people to speak to, or what experiences to decide to do, and then perhaps which to include in the book. In terms of the people, a lot of it is. So I would reach out to someone that perhaps I'd seen someone mentioned in a newspaper article, or in a blog post, or on a website called like LA Taco, or in the LA Times, or heard on the radio, and maybe there's just a little brief story about them. Like there was a story about a school in, I think, Nutter, California, or Nuffer, I'm not going to remember it correctly right now, but the principal was very shortly interviewed, but his school had the most homeless kids out of all the public schools in LA County. The most kids who had experienced within like the last calendar year or 2 calendar years, they'd either experienced homelessness or they'd had to live for a period of time out of a car or in a hotel, something like that. So the details that he was sharing in a brief interview with KCET, I think, in any case, they were pretty sad. And then I reached out to him, and he's like, oh yeah, and so we started talking. And he starts giving me all these amazing success stories, like the parents that like had been taking home, they were giving out these backpacks of foods, right, to the families so the kids would have extra food home. And parents who were taking home like 2 or 3 bags because they had 4 kids at home, but they were able to accept that sort of generosity and then save money, and that got them into this new apartment, and it changed everything for their family. And so one thing is just hearing a story, talking to the person, and then finding out, oh, the story goes this way, And then sometimes it's often a matter of trust, because like, who am I? I'm like, who are any of us? You call up someone who's a stranger, especially you're like, so I'm working on a book. I mean, that's the weirdest thing to say to someone, because it's like a book. Like, no one works on books anymore. Like, I could say, like, I'm working on a podcast, and be like, oh, cool. What's your podcast? I've got a podcast. My mom has a podcast. You should take my mom's podcast. In any case, so the bar is quite low when you tell someone you're working on a book. And so perhaps that helps for getting people to open up to you. But there's also, especially in entering or talking to people in communities that are not, whether you look at me and the color of my skin or the cut of my jib, perhaps it's not my community, that person's going to need to trust you before starting to want to share things with you, especially if those things might be considered dirty laundry, right? So you have to establish trust, relationship. I mean, again, I worked on this book for like 2.5, 3 years, but the cool thing is, once you establish that relationship, that person is more likely to be like, yo, you should talk to my uncle, because my uncle is a weirdo, but he's got this, he's really into drag racing, and I don't know if you're into drag racing, but there's a whole subculture. Like, I got invited to a amateur backyard wrestling sort of circuit in Long Beach. I also got invited to, this did not go there. I was like, I do not want to join your odd sex group in the valley. But I also got invited, I got to meet vampires. So this is a quick anecdote. It's believed that Los Angeles County has the 2nd highest concentration of what are called real vampires, capital R, capital V, in the country. The real vampires that I got to know said that the largest community is around Shreveport, Louisiana. But the 2nd largest is in LA County, and they have monthly meetups. Their monthly meetup is at a dive bar in Burbank. Literally, it's just the vampires get together for wings and beer. But so I had to go through several connections before, because the vampires were like, we do not talk to media. Because how they define themselves is that vampires, in their estimation, are people who enjoy the lifestyle, as in Halloween or the HBO series True Blood, or they just enjoy dressing kind of gothy. Whereas real vampires are those that enjoy consuming the plasma of other humans or having their plasma consumed by humans, often in what becomes a very close relationship with either the vamp or This is, I didn't know.
I
You're just sitting with my notebook. You
You
can't
moved
make that
into
sound.
lawyer speak.
Yeah, I know.
A close relationship between
Well, no,
vampires.
because sometimes it was an erotic relationship, but sometimes it wasn't. This is as it was described to me. Again, I only met a group of about 5 of them, and only 2 of them really wanted to talk at length. But they were in a they were in a relationship. The 2 I ended up talking to. The woman, her day job was as a nurse practitioner, and the guy was an IT support worker. And he showed me on his. He was the how do you put it? He was her donor, let's just say, and she was the vampire. And he had all these hatch marks on his shoulder where she would feed from him. And she said, yeah, and she's like, it was really after the second time that we started to form more of an erotic relationship. And he's like, I'll tell you, they always want to play with their food. And I was like, only vampires can make that joke. That's so stupid. It's so stupid.
Wow.
Anyway. So there's a lot about gaining trust where possible to sort of get into, that's the long answer to your question. So when an invitation comes along to talk to a real vampire, I was quick to say yes to it. Though I think my partner was a little bit worried that, like, are you sure? Are these people cool? Like, I know they meet in a pub. Yeah, so that's the long-winded answer to your question. It's just about, it just took a lot of time, but then people, when there was a sense of trust, that I would do right by them, or perhaps be someone they could trust with a story or 2. Because that was some of the stories, because there was an actor in the book, I shadowed her for a year and a half, basically, and became a good friend of hers. There was people that I would meet and spend just a day with, or I spent a week with, and so it just took time.
And sometimes the stories come to you here, like the guy on the bike with,
That's
with
right.
the film project.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
I think it's a city of stories. And obviously, in terms of Hollywood, a century of making stories.
Yeah.
Anyway, anyone else? Someone? Yes. Is that you, Mario?
Yep.
Uh-oh, here comes post-colonial theory.
I was going to ask, Los Angeles is a city-state, to use your metaphor, right? It's huge. And with that size, you got a lot of problems. Does Los Angeles have a future which looks like progress? Is there a way to understand Los Angeles that as a fragmented city-state which exists as localities, or is there a different conception of Los Angeles that allows Los Angeles to exist as like a singularity? And what would progress look like in either conception?
So just to repeat the question, if I understand you correctly, one question here has to deal with is there essentially a hopeful future or a future of progress available to Los Angeles, in my opinion? And is there something akin to perhaps a different form in the future of Los Angeles, whether it's a city-state or perhaps a singularity, or perhaps are there other ways to understand LA that sort of look to that, where we're going next or what we might become? And is that about accurate? So I'll tell you one thing that occurred to me in the research for the book, is that we are all slowly, and perhaps quickly, but it feels slowly, moving on to the internet. A lot of just time in our day is spent on the internet or in the web somehow. And that has increased, obviously, since the emergence of the internet. And that can have extreme forms. I talk in the book about a group of gamers called the Phase Clan, who occupy a house in the Hollywood Hills, who have, literally, they can be in New York City, and there are 10,000 people on the streets waiting to see them. Like, they're just a very famous group of gamers. I think they might specialize in Fortnite, but I'm not sure. And they were profiled in the New York Times. They was talking about how they never leave the house. They are in the house all the time, gaming all day, practicing for these tournaments. They make an enormous amount of money based on sponsorships, selling merchandise, and so on. But the kids were quite depressed, is how it sounded. And one of them, though, talked about how just wanting to move on to the internet full time. Now, obviously, we're also in a unique period here where people who perhaps have had the luxury, but perhaps are also suffering from it, have been working mostly online rather than doing their jobs in an office or in a store. Now, I'm not even going to begin to disrespect the amount of people who did not have that luxury and who are doing checkout at Vons, or who are driving a bus, or who are riding the bus to go do checkout at Vons. Every other job that also required them during this period we're going through to put their lives on the line in a way that really was dangerous, or has been dangerous, or is dangerous, and don't have that luxury. But also, that's not to belittle how difficult this period has been for everybody, right? I mean, short of, I think even Elon Musk is having a hard time, you know, but I'm not going to get into that. He's like off digging a tunnel right now in Hawthorne, for all I know. But he's his own singularity, so maybe that's one version of what we'll look like. We will all just be subsumed into Elon Musk. He will probably figure out a way to do that. In the meantime, this is a hard period, but this period is changing society, in my opinion, as I see things and as I talk to people. And that's in Los Angeles and obviously on greater schemes. One other aspect, though, of talking to, so there's an aspect that our lives are moving online, and that is changing what LA will look like, just as it's changing a lot of places. At the same time, in my experience and in the reporting and research for the book, there is a feudalism going on in LA. There is, like I said, there's extraordinary wealth in Los Angeles. Sometimes it's quite obvious. You can go drive to Bel Air and do a tour, and you can just see it, you know, in whoever's, I don't know if anyone drove a supercar here tonight, but you know, there are evident displays of wealth in Los Angeles all the time. And no judgment if you did. I'm kind of a car guy, even though I drive a Honda Accord. So if you did drive a Lamborghini here tonight, you want to let me ride in it later, awesome. But it is a city of immense poverty, right? That is sometimes on display and sometimes not. And when I think about what the future looks like, the idea that the middle class is disappearing, because that was a facet or one of the hallmarks of city-states in the past. If we go back to Athens and Carthage, and even today's Singapore, right? There's very little of the middle class. There are people who are being served, and there are people who are doing the serving, and that can be, you know, now in Starbucks, or it can be in other forms. But, and I'll wrap this up because I don't want to blow hard too long here, but the point is, in talking to so many people for this book, I met so many people who are doing the hard work every day and seeming to really enjoy it to make Los Angeles a little bit better. And that is in categories that hopefully we all recognize, but it can always be recognized more, whether that's a school teacher or someone who's working as a social worker, but also people, arts organizations, groups that are, I mean, I don't have to do this, like we all know who I'm talking about. It's anybody who gets up and is just trying to make life a little bit better for everybody else, right? And that kind of spirit, and that kind of enthusiasm, I just started volunteering the other day at the Community Exchange. It's part of the Hollywood Food Coalition, which is an extraordinary, basically, food kitchen or soup kitchen that's been serving meals like every night, I think since like 1974, like they haven't missed a night. But they just started this thing called the Community Exchange, which enables fourth wave coffee shops and Whole Foods and, you know, very fancy pizza places, when they have food that's still fine, but they can't sell it anymore, they'll talk to the Community Exchange. Community Exchange then finds someone who perhaps is running a kitchen to help people, families that are having a hard time in somewhere in another neighborhood or in this neighborhood. The point is, it's a great little organization in Hollywood, and I'm meeting all these people there that are in their 20s and in their 30s. The woman who I met who's kind of running it came from Virginia. She's all into sort of helping get food into people's mouths. Anyway, awesome, right? Like, here are people that are willing to take, you know, not a very big salary, and it's really making a big impact. And so seeing that and seeing that kind of dynamism, I'm sure there are people that I could be shouting out right now who are doing extraordinary city planning that I just don't know about and deserve all the credit. But on a very small level, people doing all these great things to try and make Los Angeles a little bit better gives me a lot of hope that the future it can be quite good. But I don't have a magic 8 ball otherwise.
Nice. You know, it's interesting because everything you said that's been revelatory to you has involved you getting out of your apartment.
Yeah.
And being face to face with people.
Yeah. And it's so good to be back doing this, or having
Right.
conversations, or talking to people, or just like being awkward in conversation, be like, I don't know how to do this, you know, all that. It's great. Bring it.
Yeah. I live in a courtyard apartment complex, and at some point we had some people over to our terrace, and we're not great friends, we're neighbors, and so just wanted to hug them all because they were human beings.
Yeah.
And we were sitting close to each other and talking about nothing.
Right.
Except it was everything.
Right.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
So one of the things that you talked about in the book was kind of the changing neighborhoods and gentrification across all of LA.
Yep.
And I think, that paired with the non-changing aspects of LA, single-family homes staying single-family homes, but there only being so much room. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to whether or not you feel that these economic pressures from a real estate perspective are going to potentially take away some of the things that make LA so unique in the sense of people coming here finding space and opportunity as rents go up and housing isn't being built.
Yeah, so so the question is, in thinking about how LA is transforming kind of in the built environment, but also, perhaps switching from less single-family homes to more multifamily housing, is that, or just as LA is changing in general, rents going up and cost of living going up, will that change LA's character or perhaps take away some things that make LA special, or is that the vibe?
Yeah, I think it's like that paired with the fact that Beverly Hills isn't going to change and isn't going to build multifamily, so you have those kind of competing pressures.
Right.
And there are other cities in the U.S., Seattle, San Francisco, that have faced similar pressures, and a lot of the culture has kind of drained out to a certain extent, or has become a little bit more one note. And I'm curious whether you think something like that could potentially happen in LA, given its kind of unique geographic location.
Yeah, sure. Interestingly, I did an event last week in Culver City, hosted by an architecture society, and there were some people there asking questions at the end. One, very much an opponent of changing LA's model from being sort of single-family homes into multifamily homes, and one being a proponent of it, being like, we need to have more housing, and that means more multifamily housing, especially near transit and so forth. And so they were getting into it, and we all got into it a little bit, which is great. So in terms of, this is a tricky one because I'm not a housing expert. I don't know anything about housing, honestly. Like, this is not a policy arena that I'm well versed in beyond what we've done research for this book. I feel like there's no question that LA needs more housing, to my mind. At the same time, single-family housing has been the great American investment vehicle, besides the stock market, for all ranges, all kinds of peoples, all kinds of societies, and still seems to be that way. That it's still something you can hold on to and potentially pass down to your children and recoup value. The one thing I like about LA, it again comes back to size and scale. Now, we are perennially foolish enough to build housing in places that catch on fire every couple of years. So that's, putting that aside, I get the sense here that there is room to experiment. And hopefully there's room to experiment respectfully and thoughtfully, and not just greedily. And LA's going to change anyway. I don't want to see an Apple, Whole Foods, Starbucks, I don't want to see LA become Jeff Bezos' farm, right? Like, everyone's already tilling the soil for Jeff Bezos, so we don't need more of that. Inevitably it'll happen, but I love LA. Oh God, I just said that.
You did. Yes, you did.
Cut that out. But I do, right? Let's not be super cheesy, but that was pretty cheesy. But my point is, I really respond to the variety of Los Angeles, and I find it to be too big, too diverse, too many competing interests to imagine that it's going to be fading fast. Other things, superficially, I don't know. So Manhattan is so dense, right? I'm not playing the LA versus New York game. That's stupid. New Yorkers are so anxious about that right now, and I think Angelenos are just like, what? I don't care about New York. It's a nice shopping mall.
I think you just playing the game.
Yeah, I'm kind of playing the game. But it's Manhattan is so dense, and that things really do change on the surface. But LA can change foundationally, I feel like, with greater ease. And so I'm hoping that sense that you can rip something up and turn it into something different actually can lead to good things and not just bad things.
And we know about the bad things from Norman Klein's The History of Forgetting, but it doesn't have to be just that. That's the nature of change. Right. Anyone else? Yes, right here.
Thanks for talking to us, Krantz. I'm very interested in the image you chose to be front and center. It's a two-part question. So one is kind of opportunity to explain that image, and then also LA seems to be more so than other cities have an obsession with kind of spirituality, esotericism, mysticism, and very interested on your take on those layers within LA.
For sure. Yeah, really quickly, the cover, so unfortunately, I had nothing to do with the cover, except it was designed by an art director named Rodrigo Corral, who's a fabulous art director, and these are photographs by a great LA photographer named Mike Slack, and I think he's wonderful. You should find him on Instagram. I know that part of the inspiration behind the cover was, you know how you drive around LA and you'll see on telephone poles at intersections or whatever, people will put up just signs like, you know, I buy houses for cash, yard sale this weekend, come check out my show on Saturday night at this club, blah, blah, blah. And there was a LA printer called, I believe, Colby Printing. I want to say they were on La Brea. I think they might have closed in the early 2000s, but they were a real aesthetic touch point for a lot of LA artists because they would always do the same kind of signs. They were always on fluorescent stock paper. All their fonts were like big black, sometimes italicized, sometimes not. Maybe it's like an ombre effect, maybe it's a bright pink, maybe it's a yellow, whatever. And so Rodrigo just wanted to pay homage to that because he was like, I want a cover that looks LA to people from LA. And so that was the inspiration of it. Again, no credit on mine, all credit Rodrigo and Mike. And then in terms of LA being a place where people perhaps have an interest in religion or mysticism or different belief systems, or perhaps come here for those things. You know, I think the way I've seen it has been that LA has been classically associated with a certain open-mindedness. Again, there's a lot of closed-mindedness too. I'm not trying to say it's all one way here, but you know, people have been coming here for a long time with the sense that they can change something about their life. And that could be a job, that could be, I'm going out, I want to be a different person, I want to get away from this small town that I came from and just, you know, or I want to meet somebody that looks a little bit different, whatever it is. And I think that attitude can also then be, not to say that's not deep, but can it be in the deeper realms of sort of saying, why am I here? Why are we all here? What is my purpose in life? You know, those questions, it's a questioning town, I think. You know, it's also a place where you can just have your neighborhood and you're not leaving and that's your LA. And you're not even part of any of this, right? You're just doing your thing on your block, in your canyon, on your street, whatever it is. But I think when people begin to go a little outside themselves and start to ask some questions, and maybe it leads them to a church or a synagogue or a temple, or it's going to lead them into meditation, or they're going to start doing mushroom chocolates on Saturday morning, or they're going to start, I'm not equating these things, forgive me, I'm not trying to offend anybody here. I'm just saying that sense of wonderment and trying to have purpose and a sense of self and looking for fellowship in that. I think LA is just generally open to that idea. And your thing might be tacos, your thing might be meditation. Again, I don't mean to put silly next to serious. That's not, I'm not trying to be a jerk.
That's what LA does.
But yeah, so I think that quest, that sense of seeking, can like so many things, exist on a lot of different levels of depth and profundity, right? And rigor and seriousness. Some people are going to hit the books. Some people like to look at pictures. Some people just do it on their own. Some people do it in community. And I think LA has just been traditionally home to that. And it's had its negative sides where people are taking advantage of that, and we can get into cults, or we can get into things that have money attached to it in nasty ways. And then there are so many places where it is holy, and it can be profound, and it can be just something that creates a lot of meaning for people. And so I think LA is home to all that.
Nice.
That was long-winded, though.
No, that was a great answer. That's a difficult question, but it's a good question. And related to that, one of our upcoming events is November 4th. We're screening a new documentary film called Holywood by director Courtney Sell. I think Courtney's here tonight. But I encourage you to come here and watch the screening because it's about that very thing. Why in Los Feliz, Silver Lake, and Hollywood do we have this collection of esoteric, alternative religions and spiritualities, Vedanta Center, Gnostic Center, PRS, other places, the Self-Realization Fellowship. Why in LA, first of all, and that's a good answer right there, but why within this little enclave within LA? And you'll hear interviews from people about Crotona, Old Crotona, and PRS, and those other places. It's a really good film, so I hope you'll come back for that. Any other maybe final questions? Yes?
Hi. What do you think, what's your take on the fact that we literally have countries here outside of their country?
Yeah.
I mean, that hasn't, in a way, they've all come here and been absorbed into the greater LA vision, which has sort of superseded their own identity to a degree.
Yeah.
But maybe not. Like, how interesting that would be. I mean, when you talk about feudal stuff, I mean,
Yeah.
we have countries living here, and yet they do so very happily.
And when you say countries, do you mean just in terms of like very large populations of people from other countries?
Right,
living
like
here in
Vietnam.
community?
This is Vietnam outside of Vietnam, and same for
Oh, I see what you're
Persia,
saying, right.
You know, and Armenia. I mean, we have that
Little
population.
Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really interesting because where else in the world do vast populations live generally so sort of peacefully and happily as they do here, side by side? You know, you don't have conflicts between these groups. I mean, it's really interesting.
Yeah, so the question was talking about the different sort of nation states that exist within Los Angeles, and I talked to, for example, interviewed the director of, one of the biggest refugee resettlement groups, and prior to the previous White House administration, they were resettling quite a few people in Los Angeles, and so I was asking him potentially about the difficulty of someone, if you are a refugee coming from somewhere in Southeast Asia, somewhere in Eastern Africa, somewhere in the Middle East, and what's it like to be in LA? And he was saying, well, yeah, if you look around Los Angeles, you know, we have an enormous Ethiopian population, we have an enormous population in little Tehrangeles, you know, from Iran, we have an enormous population in some of those places. Yes, it is the largest population of people from that country outside of that country, you know, which is extraordinary. And I would push back a little. I would say that we have sometimes quite a lot of conflict between different groups. But at the same time, it is extraordinary, I think, in the broad scheme of things, that people do live side by side, generally getting along and getting through each day. So I don't really have an answer here. I also feel an expression of wonder about it, and I think it's pretty marvelous. I think it's a great aspect of Los Angeles. I think Los Angeles is still a place where the diversity of Los Angeles is a significant asset to the city, to the community, and I think quite a few people, not all obviously, but people respect that here in a way that is not always respected elsewhere in the United States.
Yeah. Any other questions for Rosecrans?
What's your next book?
Great question. I am working on it couldn't be more different. It's like a thriller set in France. That's it. Yeah.
A novel?
It's a novel, yeah.
Nice. And you have other novels?
Yes.
Which are called?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I will plug that. My first novel was called You Lost Me There. The second novel was called The Last Kid Left. And then there's another nonfiction book about what it's like to live and work in France at a French ad agency that's called Paris, I Love You, but You're Bringing Me Down. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And if you would, I'll plug this if you won't, I'm sure you will too. If you would like a copy of the book, they have them at the bookstore here. Yeah. If you have a copy with you or you want to buy one here, I'm happy to sign it. I would love to sign it. I would love to meet anybody afterwards. It's been really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosecrans.